By early May 1997, Andrew Cunanan had already traveled across several states. 3 men were dead. The investigation had now spread far beyond Minneapolis and Chicago. Law enforcement agencies across the country were working together to track a suspect who appeared to be constantly moving. But even as investigators attempted to follow Cunanan's path, the killer was already planning his next move. After leaving Chicago in the stolen Lexus belonging to Lee Miglin, Cunanan continued driving east. The journey carried him hundreds of miles toward the East Coast. Gas stations, highway exits, roadside restaurants. To the people who briefly crossed his path during that journey, he appeared to be just another traveler passing through. Few people could have imagined that the man behind the wheel of that vehicle had already committed multiple murders. But Cunanan's ability to keep moving would soon reach a turning point. Because at some stage during his journey, he realized that the Lexus could no longer be used safely. The car had already been connected to the murder of Lee Miglin. Police were actively searching for it, which meant Cunanan needed another vehicle. And that decision would lead him to his next victim, a man named William Reese. William Reese lived a quiet life. He worked as a caretaker at a cemetery in Pennsville, a small community located along the Delaware River. Reese was known as a hard-working man who preferred a simple routine. His days were often spent maintaining the cemetery grounds, cutting grass, repairing headstones, keeping the property clean for visiting families. Friends and colleagues described Reese as someone who valued steady work and quiet surroundings. He was not a man connected to the world of wealthy businessmen or complicated social circles, which made the events that followed even more tragic. On May 9, 1997, investigators believe Cunanan encountered Reese while traveling through Pennsville. The exact circumstances of their meeting remain unclear, but investigators believe Cunanan approached Reese while he was working. At that moment, Cunanan needed transportation. Authorities later concluded that Reese's pickup truck became the target. Reese was shot. The attack happened quickly. There was no prolonged struggle, no extended confrontation. Unlike some of the earlier murders, this killing appeared purely practical. Cunanan needed a vehicle, and Reese had one. After the shooting, Cunanan took Reese's red pickup truck and continued his journey south. The simplicity of the crime made it especially chilling. For investigators, the Reese murder represented a dangerous shift. Until this point, Cunanan's victims had all existed within some connection to his social or personal life. But William Reese had no known relationship to Cunanan at all. He was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, which meant that Cunanan's violence had entered a new phase. The killings were no longer tied to personal relationships. They were becoming opportunistic, random, unpredictable. And that realization terrified investigators. Because if Cunanan was willing to kill strangers simply to obtain what he needed, then anyone who crossed his path could become the next victim. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to grow. By this point, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had joined the search. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states were exchanging information and coordinating efforts. Cunanan's photograph was now appearing across national television broadcasts. Newspapers printed his image on their front pages. Millions of Americans were now aware that a dangerous fugitive was on the run. But even with the entire country looking for him, Cunanan still managed to disappear. After leaving Pennsville with Reese's truck, he continued traveling south. At various points, investigators later believed he moved through parts of the East Coast before eventually reaching Florida. For weeks, there were few confirmed sightings. Cunanan seemed to vanish. Some investigators began to wonder whether he had fled the country. Others believed he was hiding somewhere within the United States. But what no one knew at the time was that Cunanan had already reached his next destination, a city known for its beaches, nightlife, and international visitors. A place where a fugitive could blend into crowds. That city was Miami Beach. And it was there that Andrew Cunanan would commit the murder that would shock the entire world, the killing of Gianni Versace. By the middle of May 1997, the investigation into Andrew Cunanan had grown into something far larger than a local homicide case. What began as the murder of Jeffrey Trail in Minneapolis had now expanded across multiple states. Trail was dead. David Madsen had been found murdered near Rush Lake. In Chicago, wealthy real estate developer Lee Miglin had been brutally killed inside his home. And in Pennsville, cemetery caretaker William Reese had been murdered simply for his vehicle. 4 victims, 4 crime scenes, multiple states, and 1 suspect, Andrew Cunanan. As investigators compared evidence from each location, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Cunanan was moving quickly across the country. He appeared to be traveling alone. And each time he changed vehicles, another victim appeared. For law enforcement, the situation presented enormous challenges. The murders had occurred in different jurisdictions, each with its own police department and investigative process. Information had to be shared across state lines. Investigators had to coordinate interviews, forensic evidence, and witness statements across hundreds of miles. Soon, the Federal Bureau of Investigation officially joined the search. The FBI began coordinating efforts between local police departments and federal investigators. Cunanan's photograph was distributed nationwide. Television networks broadcast his image across the country. Newspapers printed his face on their front pages. Suddenly, billions of Americans were looking for the same man. But even with this massive attention, Cunanan continued to evade capture. One of the most frustrating aspects of the investigation was the lack of clear motive. Investigators struggled to understand why Cunanan had chosen his victims. The first 2 murders involved people who knew him, but the later killings appeared random. Without a clear pattern, predicting Cunanan's next move became nearly impossible. Some investigators believed Cunanan might attempt to leave the country. His family background and travel history meant he had connections outside the United States. Airports and border crossings were alerted. But there was no evidence he had attempted to flee internationally. Others believed Cunanan might attempt to hide within a large city. In a crowded urban environment, someone could blend into the population, especially if they avoided drawing attention to themselves. But even with these theories, the investigation had little concrete information about Cunanan's location. Weeks passed. Then another complication emerged. Cunanan had effectively vanished. Despite the massive publicity surrounding the case, confirmed sightings became rare. Investigators received hundreds of tips from members of the public. Some people believed they had seen Cunanan at gas stations. Others believed they had encountered him in restaurants or hotels. But over time, more reports began to emerge. Witnesses described a man who looked like Cunanan. someone staying in cheap hotels, someone seen walking through neighborhoods, someone who seemed to be observing wealthy homes and luxury vehicles. Investigators began focusing their attention on the Miami area. But even then, the search proved difficult. Cunanan appeared to be moving carefully. He avoided drawing attention. He blended into the crowds of tourists and residents who filled the streets of Miami Beach. For weeks, he remained hidden in plain sight, until the morning of July 15, 1997, when Andrew Cunanan approached the gates of a mansion on Ocean Drive. Inside that mansion lived one of the most famous designers in the world, a man whose name had become synonymous with luxury fashion.